Hello. So this will be a update on what's on my mind for the last several weeks of national security developments. Um, it's shocking that some of these events occurred just mere weeks ago, but have already been overcome by other dramatic developments. It's only been a matter of weeks since the Indian Pakistani conflict that start to spill over as a result of a Pakistani terrorist attack, radical group potentially tied to the Pakistani government or at least loosely affiliated to the intelligence services, conducted an attack on Indian civilians, and the Indian military responded. That conflict is a part of a series of different exchanges of fire between the two countries. It seems to have cooled with neither India or Pakistan as nuclear powers wanting to have that fight escalate. The president's first trip overseas to Saudi Arabia, to the Middle East, with promises of trillions of dollars in revenues, mainly resulted in a series of transactions between Trump Inc. And Trump's friends that are engaging in economic relationships for self benefit. And the message from that trip um, is that Trump can be bribed, is that appeals to Trump personally to enrich Trump or advance Trump personally can yield results, whether it's on tariff reductions, favorable trade agreements. Same thing for Trump's closest allies being able to engage in deals. Very, very different than other economically focused trips that presidents have taken. This one was singularly focused on Trump and his inner circle. And of course, there was the Qatari plane transfer, a plane that supposedly cost $400 million. That's going to likely cost at least that much to refit and make it suitable for Air Force One, or otherwise it just sits parked until Trump leaves office and is transferred to him for his personal use under the auspices of the Trump Presidential Library. Another corrupt scheme. The Putin Zelensky phone calls that occurred about 2 weeks ago, where Trump, on the back end of a phone call with Putin, dropped the demands for an immediate ceasefire and instead started to urge negotiations absent a ceasefire. Frankly, a pretty critical criteria. Trying to start negotiations without some sort of reduction in the really sharp battles is not necessarily a fruitful place to start. Of course, it has happened. There have been historical patterns where we've tried to ratchet up pressure on our adversaries. Vietnam comes to mind, but this is a very significant turn for the Trump administration, and one in which there seems to be a bit of a pattern of frustration with Putin, but still a lot of cheerleading for the Russian side and damning of the Ukrainians, suggesting that the Ukrainians are not, fully ready to compromise. And of course, the Ukrainians have been. The interesting component here is that there might be a pattern of shifting um, thinking on whether accommodating Russia is the path to ending the war, or increasing pressure on Russia and continuing to sustain support for Ukraine is the path to compel Russia to negotiate in good faith. And that's a favorable term. Two things come to mind. One, first, that the U.S. only suspended support to Ukraine for a short period of time, 11 days. Other than that, we're in a reasonably good condition where we might not be promising these large aid transfers, but there are still programs in place. The intelligence sharing is occurring. The Ukrainians are getting access to resources at a slower pace, and the Russians, Putin in particular, is potentially on the outs. Too early to say. I think this is still a months long process of hard learning for Trump to get there to return to something resembling a strategy to end the war. Next thing I'll mention is tensions in the Middle East with regards to Israel's desire to strike out at Iran and end the last real credible threat to existential threat to Israel's survival, which is Iran and Iran's nuclear program, and the U.S. Appetite for another war in the Middle East. Trump is not interested. I was concerned that the threshold for hostilities against Iran were quite low. Turns out that um, he is he has been made aware of the consequences of a war with Iran, and that it would be not a swift military operation, airstrikes, but it would be a long, potentially a longer war. You could see that in the way that the U.S. has kind of backed off on attacks on the Houthis, the Iranian proxies, that the U.S. is pushing for um, this nuclear deal. Kind of interesting in that it resembles something along the lines of what President Obama achieved with the JCPOA, um, some 10 years ago, and that we're returning to something reasonable and normal. Now, whether that's something that the Israelis will accept, that's unclear. Um, it's possible they'll see a situation in which Trump is too forgiving or too accommodating, and it doesn't account for Israel's needs. And Israel, in a moment of in a condition where the relationship with Trump and Netanyahu is becoming more shaky, is looking at a closing window to take action against Iran. So I think the next weeks, couple months, will be particularly dangerous. But cooler heads seem to be prevailing on the U.S. side, and it's a military attack on Iran is still a tool of last resort. Um, I think some other things that are important. Um, I made some notes, so I'm going through them in sequence. Some late pronunciations, announcements from Putin and Lavrov. Really, I think on the in two different directions. One, still trying to keep Trump on sides and dangling the prospects of peace. Um, but two, also kind of taking recognizing that the relationship with uh, between Trump and Putin may end up having an expiration date. You hear the rhetoric from top leaders in Russia changing to the fact that Trump is irrational, um, weak, that Ukraine will be subdued, returning to this maximalist demand that Ukraine have different leadership, conduct elections, or install a pro-Russian leadership. Um, some of that has been paired with increased air attacks on Ukrainian cities, some of the biggest attacks since the beginning of the war, some efforts to mount larger attacks along the front line, and some, I think, demonstrations, because I think they're unlikely to open up some new fronts in areas around Kharkiv and Suma that have been cold since 2022 when Ukraine expelled forces in that eastern and northeastern part of the country. But the language is kind of hardened in a way that looks less accommodating. Um, the NSC firings, the plan to reduce by half the size of the National Security Council. So, I take this one, of course, personally. I think I tend to be called out as the driver or the impetus to eliminate the professional staff, those folks that are unknown from Department of Defense, Department of State, the intelligence community as potentially untrustworthy, insufficiently loyal. I mean, they're there because they're the professionals and advancing U.S. national security interests, adhering to their oaths, but they're seen as potentially dangerous and not sufficiently loyal. The interesting thing is that these folks will, just like I would, follow the orders of the President of the United States as long as they're legal. I mean, that's what we're there for. That's why we have a professional civil service. So as long as those orders, they could be bad policy, but as long as they're not illegal, I think the fact is that the NSC would implement those policies or walk away. That's also an option, to resign. And instead, they're choosing to fire these folks that are critical to implementing and the president's policies and coordinating, making sure our government's synchronized in its actions. So that's a pretty disturbing turn, but something I've written about and forecasted was going to happen. Um, I think I will probably close with a couple thoughts on what I see happening on the horizon on the domestic front. President Trump is conducting a parade for himself on June 14th, claiming it's for the Army birthday. This would be a wide departure from historical patterns. We don't have parades of this kind. Certainly, the Navy and the Air Force don't have a parade scheduled. This one just happens to land on June 14th, the Army's birthday and the President's birthday. And this is going to cost tens of millions of dollars, involve thousands of troops, hundreds of pieces of equipment, and attempt to demonstrate the president's strength. And why this is disturbing to me, look, I'm an army guy. I like to see our amazing troops out representing the force, and our equipment, um, guys with toys and stuff like that. But this to me is unseemly because I attended the Russian Victory Day parades as an attaché assigned to the U.S. Embassy, military attaché, and that's what authoritarian regimes do to indicate their strength, to flex their muscles. The U.S. military doesn't do that. It doesn't need to. It's the most powerful military in the world. So I also recognize that this is coinciding with what's planned, the indivisible protests. So thousands of protesters, tens of thousands of protesters in Washington and around the country. This is likely to be in aggregate uh, bigger than the hands-off protests that occurred a couple of months back. That resulted in about 5.5 million people on the streets, and the mix of military parading and civilians protesting, to me, opens up some thinking on some dangerous scenarios and the use of the military against civilians. And that's something I've been thinking about. I'll talk about it some more at a later time. There, under the first administration, the president was deterred, warned off against using the military against protesters. I think this time the threshold is much, much lower, and the chance of the military being called out into the streets becomes higher, and that it becomes a dangerous mix. The military is trained to disobey legal orders, so this is not a scenario in which troops are going to be firing into peaceful unarmed protesters, but it's still a dangerous mix and something that I'm worried about, and working to figure out how we bolster non-commissioned officers' uh, willingness to display moral courage and disobey illegal orders. And how do we protect the civilian population and our democracy and First Amendment rights? So we'll talk more about that some other time, but I wanted to do a quick update and reconnect and do another one of these in the coming weeks. Thanks for listening, and thanks for being subscribers to Why It Matters.